The inaugural issue of the New Thinking Aloud magazine was just released on March 1st. You can download a free PDF copy from the New Thinking Aloud Foundation website. That's newthinkingaloud.org. You can even order a printed copy from nta-magazine.magcloud.com.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore behavioral memories associated with cases of the reincarnation type. With me is Dr. James Matlock, an anthropologist who is the co-author with Erlander Haraldson of a recent book called I Saw a Light and Came Here, Children's Experiences of Reincarnation. He also contributes articles to the Psi Encyclopedia, published by the Society for Psychical Research in England. He is, as I mentioned, an anthropologist and the author of dozens of academic papers on reincarnation, parapsychology, anthropology, and related areas. Welcome, Jim.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm glad to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. We've been delving into reincarnation. We're taking, I guess you might say, a deep dive. We've done 3 previous interviews now. I want to encourage our viewers to check out. But the theme now are behavioral memories, and that's an interesting topic. Let's define, first of all, for our viewers, what we mean by a behavioral memory.
Okay. Well, behavioral memories are behaviors shown by the subject of a reincarnation case, that is, a child typically who recalls a previous life, that are consistent with the person whose life he recalls. Yeah. That is, the child behaves in ways like the previous person behaved.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me in a way, I know we haven't touched on this yet, but I know you're aware there's a literature in the field of heart and lung transplants where a person who receives a transplant from a donor, right, a deceased donor, often acquires some of the behaviors that were associated with that donor.
Yes, and those are really very interesting cases. Unfortunately, it's hard to research them because of confidential issues, maintained by the hospitals. Hospitals who do these the transplants normally want to keep the donors and the recipients as separate from each other. So it's only occasionally that the donor becomes known, and then it becomes possible to compare certain behaviors of the recipient has shown, and some of these are really very bizarre, behaviors. One I recall, the recipient started of I think it was of a heart or maybe heart lung, started calling his wife by the name of his donor's wife.
I see.
But there are other things that are more strictly behavioral as well. Yes, and those are similar to what we see in the reincarnation cases. But in the reincarnation cases, we have the added element that the children are remembering a specific previous person with whom they're identifying.
Yes.
So in addition to talking about memories that they have of that person, they're also showing behaviors, demonstrating behaviors.
Yeah, and of course there's no physical connection like a heart-lung transplant.
Right, there's not. There's not. So it would have to be a metaphysical, I suppose one would say, connection to reincarnation.
Well, and some of these behaviors include, for example, we referred to this briefly before, xenoglossy, actually speaking in a language that the child had never been exposed to.
Right. And those are some of the most interesting types of behaviors. We see that with xenoglossy in cases where the previous person spoke a different language or perhaps spoke in a different dialect, in some way expressed herself differently than the subject, the case subject, as the child, who remembers that life. And when there is a difference in language, the child subject often will speak in ways, use language in ways, even be able to converse in that language like the previous person.
And also there are talents, like child prodigies acquire talents presumably from past lives.
Well, and that's an interesting subject because child prodigies are one of the, should we say, classic ways that reincarnation was thought to manifest. Even before Stevenson's work, people would point to child prodigies and say, oh, this has to be evidence of reincarnation. In fact, Stevenson found very little evidence of child prodigies as such.
In other words, the child prodigies don't tend to remember past lives.
At least that. Yes, that's all we can say.
Yeah.
I mean, it may well be that the explanation for child prodigies, musical prodigies, math prodigies, whatever, is the carryover of memories or behaviors from the previous life. But because the child didn't say anything, we can't be sure, it's pure speculation in that case.
But aren't there sometimes examples of other talents?
Well, but there are also a couple of examples now. I mean, since Stevenson's day, we do have a couple of examples of what could be called, prodigies. That is, more developed skills.
Yes.
And we do have several examples of skills short of prodigies. But for instance, a recent case that the viewers may be familiar with of a boy who identified himself as Lou Gehrig, reborn, was from a very young age liked to play baseball, wanted to play it all the time, practice all the time, and eventually was allowed to throw out the first ball in a Los Angeles Dodgers game.
Oh.
But he also identified himself as Lou Gehrig to his mother, and he had memories that were consistent with Lou Gehrig's life. So in his case, it wasn't just the behavioral element that seemed to carry over. He also had the memories.
And more than behavioral, we're talking about, I presume, a level of talent.
Well, yes, and it's a level of talent, yes, but it was the talent was developed, and this is important, through his continuing practice. I mean, he liked to, and it's hard to separate that, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, but that's what athletes do. They practice all the time, and that's how they become.
Well, in my case, I was never very athletic to begin with. I never had much motivation to practice. I think you need a certain level of talent before you get the kind of feedback that encourages you to practice.
Well, that's right. Yes. And so you can't say that there was some talent there to begin with, and it was nurtured and through the continuing practice. And Jim Tucker, who is Ian Stevenson's successor at the University of Virginia, has a case of a golf prodigy. It's very similar to the Christian Haupt case of a boy who, from a very young age, enjoyed playing golf and became very good at it. And in later childhood, began, winning junior tournaments and things like that. So now, short of prodigies, we do see examples of skills, real skills. And these skills are in some ways almost more interesting because they emerge sort of full blown, and they aren't just tendencies towards something which is then nurtured through practice until it becomes something.
Well, the acquisition of a full-blown skill, I would think, would count as evidence against what we referred to in our previous interview as the living agent psi hypothesis, because having a skill is not the same as acquiring information through clairvoyance.
No, I don't think it is either. There are philosophers who, however, claim that it might be possible to do that, but I don't know. I'm quite skeptical of that argument, frankly. I don't see much evidence of it. I mean, that is reaching into what we talked last time about super psi. We're moving beyond what the level of psi that can be demonstrated in the laboratory to something we have to imagine, an imagined capability, and sort of imagine that if that capability is developed in a certain way, then that perhaps would explain this. But I just think a simpler explanation, once we can agree, if that's possible, that reincarnation is a viable explanation of these cases, it becomes much simpler than to simply accept that the skills are somehow carried over.
Well, what are some of these prodigious skills? I
wanted to give you an example of them. There was a Brazilian boy who recalled having been his sister. And he was a large family, 13 children, I think, as I recall. And he, the sister who had killed herself, saying she wanted to be a boy next time, was the only one in the family who had was really adept at sewing, at operating a sewing machine. Well, he also was very adept at his sister's sewing machine, the only other member of the family, only other child of the family who was. It's one of Stevenson's cases, one of the cases he investigated. And he learned on one occasion when a family servant was having trouble threading the machine. He was, less than 4, I think, at the time. Pushed her out of the way and showed her how to thread the machine, and so. When you see something like that, like a fully developed skill, emerging that way in a very young child, who's had no training. In fact, he never, he didn't want training. He said he already knew how to sew. He already knew how to operate the machine, and he showed that he did. I mean, he would finish some of his older sister's work.
I see. And are there other such examples?
I think there's a Tlingit example of a boy who was very adept at boat motors.
Now, Tlingit is a Northwest Indian tribe.
Alaskan. And the person he recalled had liked to be on the water. He'd been a fisherman, and he also had been very good at boat motors. And this young kid was remarkably adept at it. In fact, when his father was having trouble with a motor once, he stepped in and took care of the problem. So. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I gather, though, that the predominant behavioral memory that comes up in these cases would tend to be a phobia.
I think that's fair to say, yes. And we see phobias especially when death was violent. That is, the previous person died violently. The child will show some phobias that are consistent with that. They can be quite extreme sometimes. In fact, Erlinda Haraldson, my co-author of the book you mentioned earlier, likens it to post-traumatic stress disorder. So the children, it's as if the children are demonstrating the sorts of reactions that you would expect them had they lived rather than died.
So the phobia is related to the specific cause of death of the previous person.
That's right. And it can be generalized also. There's an Indian boy who I'm sorry, a lot of these cases are kind of, if not grotesque, they're really had his throat slit.
Oh.
Okay. The boy was born with a linear birthmark across his throat.
Mm-hmm.
The perpetrators of the crime happened to be distant members of the family, and by killing him, one of them hoped to clear the way for an inheritance, because the boy otherwise would have inherited this. So he happened to be a barber.
Mm.
Okay, and the boy, besides recognizing this man, was afraid of all barbers and washermen.
Oh.
Washerman had been the
cohort.
The cohort, yes, there, the two of them together, and so he generalized his fear, and he was also afraid of the place that he'd been killed. Mm. So these phobias, they relate. Yeah. They can relate to articles also. I think he was afraid of knives as well. He was afraid to articles, to places, to people.
I seem to recall a case of which the previous person had been bitten by a poisonous snake, and the young child had a phobia of snakes.
Of snakes, right? Exactly. Yeah, that's the sort of thing that we see, and in cases where they died in traffic accidents, they're afraid of motor vehicles, things like that.
Well, another type of behavioral memory would be signs of affection toward previous, the family members of the previous person.
That's right. And that's, so as I said, the children identify with the person.
Right.
I mean, it's not simply that they describe memories of that person. They really identify with them, use first person in describing these memories. I did this, I did that. And along with that, they carry the emotional memories that are appropriate to that person, so that when they encounter the people from the previous life, and see, this is a remarkable feature of many of these cases, that it has been possible that to take what the children say. They give enough information, names of places, of people, to actually track down the previous person.
Yeah.
And then when they meet the previous family, of course the person's died.
Yeah.
But when we meet that person's family, they behave towards the people in that family as like the previous person had done.
I seem to recall one instance in which the young child met the husband of the previous person and behaved toward him in a very flirtatious manner, like a wife. Right. Sat on his lap, hugged him.
Yeah, when she was a girl. Yeah, right, a girl subject, right.
Yeah.
And it can happen the other way too. Boys, Stevenson has a case where the previous person had not gotten along with his wife, and the child did not, showed a distant, distance from the previous person's wife.
So this shows that there's a lot of continuity then.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's not just the memories that are being recalled. And so there may be alternative ways to explain that, maybe through ESP, super ESP or something. But there's also this behavioral identification, which is so hugely important. And, I might mention that when Stevenson first started investigating these cases in 1960, first went to India, he wasn't prepared for this, because the accounts that he had read before that talked mainly about the memories. And he had not expected to find these sorts of behavioral demonstrations as well. And he came to think that they're probably more important, and I agree with them. They probably are more important than simply the memories, because it's so much harder to explain them. And yet they're consistent with the memories. They're entirely consistent with them.
Well, are there memories or behavioral patterns associated with gender identity?
Yes. And this is something else that's very interesting and also makes a lot of sense. When there are differences of sex, the children who are called being a member of the opposite sex will behave like that person. They'll cross dress.
Yeah.
They'll call themselves. They'll say, "I'm not I'm not a boy. It's a boy. I'm actually a girl. Or a girl will say, I'm really a boy. I am, using the present tense as well as the first person. So they really fully identify with the previous people.
So in these cases, the child, it seems that they identify more with the previous person than with their present life.
Yes. Yeah. It is very interesting. And it's true. Now, we're talking about very young children here. We're talking about, in these cases, may begin even before the second year, but more typically in the second or third year. And the behaviors may show up before the children start to talk about the previous life. We're talking about very young children, and as the children grow, the behaviors may lessen, may dim. Their memories often do fade as well. The behavioral memories may last longer, a little bit longer, but they often do fade also.
Do you find like a desire for vengeance if someone was murdered in a previous life, they want to retaliate?
Right. This is very common. Yes. Yeah. And there've been cases where the child or the child's parents sometimes wanted to prosecute the felons, but the courts, even in Asia, the courts won't allow that, or have not so far anyway.
Well, I do know of sort of a related case, maybe more mediumistic, where a medium went into trance and began producing literary works in the style of and attributed to a deceased person. And the widow of that author sued because she said, I'm entitled to the copyright, not this young child.
This person. And it is interesting that mediumistic cases we see sometimes, not with trance mediums and with mediumistic possession, we sometimes do see the mediums take on these sorts of behaviors. Again, that's one of the consistencies between the reincarnation cases and the mediumistic cases.
Yeah, the classic case that I'm thinking of is known as the chess game from the dead, in which a medium actually played a game of chess against Victor Korchnoi, a grand master of chess.
Right.
And played a very credible game.
And not only that, played in an old style.
Yes.
And played in the old style appropriate to the chess master that he claimed to have been.
Yeah. So the behavioral, I guess you could have to say, behavioral memories seem to occur in the survival literature as well as the reincarnation literature.
The mediumistic survival literature, and you also see it with apparitions. Yes, and again, a bit of evidence showing how all of these areas of survival evidence all fit together. They fit together quite nicely. There's nothing inconsistent in them.
Well, since we're talking about mediumistic communications, maybe I'm jumping around a little bit now, but I do know in an earlier interview, you mentioned the fact that in Asia, the intermission between lifetimes is relatively short, might be 14, 16, 18 months, whereas in the Western cases that we have, it can be many years.
Yes.
And it did occur to me that we're off topic, but I want to pursue this thought for a moment, that the reason for that might well be that in Western culture, we are more used to thinking in terms of survival without reincarnation. So if I've just died and I'm in some sort of another world, my expectation may be not that I'm going to reincarnate immediately, but that I'm going to spend some time here.
Yes, and we also have the expectation in the West that our loved ones will meet us when we die.
Yeah.
And we may die some years after they did. So that's also incentive then on the part of the deceased to hang around a little bit longer. And that may indeed help explain the intermission link. Now, one thing that's interesting is that it's known from the mediumistic literature that even the best communicators stop communicating after a few decades. And that is precisely the time that we then see in the reincarnation cases, that it matches the interval. So it does seem like in the West that perhaps we can explain the longer median intermissions, the longer, typical intermissions, on that basis, that people are taking longer to reincarnate in order to appear to their loved ones when they die, and in order to communicate through mediums.
So the lesson that I get from this is that, first of all, it's survival, as it's thought about in conventional Christian or Western terms, is not necessarily inconsistent with reincarnation.
No, it's not. That's a very good. Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a very good point. It's not. We can have. Now, I think resurrection is the idea that, but perhaps not. I mean, perhaps you could have several lives, and then there can be a bodily resurrection at the end of it. But at least. I mean, there can be a period of survival and stay in the afterlife before reincarnation.
And the other lesson I get from this is that these things are largely psychologically driven. That what people believe is likely to shape what actually, what one might say, the progress of the soul is shaped by the beliefs of the soul.
Yes, and I think that's another very important insight. I think that beliefs, expectations before we die probably have a lot to do with what happens after we die, and that makes sense. I mean, if consciousness does continue, if the spirit of the mind continues, then it would be perfectly natural, I think, for it to retain its personality, retain its belief systems, maintain its convictions into death. And if there's a continuing agency after death, if a spirit is able to, if it doesn't just continue, if the mind continues in some sort of control, if its cognitive processes continue, and it's able to make decisions after death, then it would be perfectly natural then for it to act in accordance with the personality and the beliefs that it had before it died.
Now, in addition to the memories and the behavioral memories, we're going to do a future interview on the physical concomitants of reincarnation. That really helps, I think, establish a very strong case for the idea, not only the idea of reincarnation, but it gives us some insights as to possible, I don't want to say mechanisms, because I don't think it's mechanistic, but
mechanisms in a general sense, in a broad sense of processes.
Processes
maybe that's
probably a better way to put it.
Yeah. And the physical things particularly bring up the importance of understanding the process. Because physical things, aren't they associated with the body? And doesn't the body die and end? So how can physical processes, how can physical traits be carried over? Yes, we'll get into that.
That's a very interesting topic. It certainly suggests that there's some sort of an organizing field, one might say, that
that's one way of looking at it.
Passes from lifetime to lifetime. Anyhow, that will be the topic of a future interview, so I encourage our viewers to check the listings for both our previous interviews and the ones that we intend to do while you're here in Las Vegas.
Well, wonderful. Okay. One thing I want to mention before we close, you started off mentioning that besides my publications that I was writing
for the Science Encyclopedia,
that I was writing for the Science Encyclopedia, which is online, and I had one of my articles for that Science Encyclopedia is on behavioral memories, and so we can encourage our viewers to go to that, because I describe several cases, and it can help illustrate what I've been talking about.
And I would hope that they can look up the articles by the author, and so that they can see
my other articles for the encyclopedia.
That would be very useful for people who are really interested in digging into this
and going further than what we're able to bring out here in these conversations.
Well, Jim Matlock, once again, thank you for being with me.
And thanks so much, Jeff. I really enjoyed it.
And thank you as well for being with us.
you.